Section 14 of A Popular History of France, Volume 5. This LibriVox is in the public domain. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 5, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 36. Henry IV, Catholic King, 1593 to 1610, Part 9. But Sully was not at the end of his embarrassments or of the sometimes feeble and sometimes sturdy fancies of his king. On the 10th of April, 1599, Gabriel d'Estrees died so suddenly that, according to the bias of the times, when in the highest ranks crimes were so common that they were always considered possible and almost probable, she was at first supposed to have been poisoned; but there seemed to be no likelihood of this. The consent of Marguerite de Valois to the annulment of her marriage was obtained, and negotiations were opened at Rome by Arnauld de Sa, who was made a cardinal, and by Brulart de Sillery, ambassador ad hoc. But a new difficulty supervened, not for the negotiators, who knew, or appeared to know, nothing about it, but for Sully. In 3 or 4 weeks after the death of Gabriel d'Estrees, Henry IV was paying court to a new favorite. One morning at Fontainebleau, just as he was going out hunting, he took Sully by the hand, led him into the first gallery, gave him a paper, and, turning the other way, as if he were ashamed to see it read by Sully, "Read that," said he, "and then tell me your opinion of it." Sully found that it was a promise of marriage given to Madele Henriette d'Entraigues, daughter of Francis de Balzac, Lord of Entraigues, and Marie Touchet, favorite of Charles IX. Sully went up to the king, holding in his hand the paper folded up. "What do you think of it?" said the king. Now, speak freely; your silence offends me far more than your most adverse expressions could. I misdoubt me much that you will not give me your approval, if it were only for the 100,000 crowns that I made you hand over with so much regret. I promise you not to be vexed at anything you can possibly say to me." "You mean it, sir, and you promise not to be angry with me, whatever I may say or do?" "Yes, yes, I promise all you desire, since for anything you say it will be all the same, neither more nor less." Thereupon, taking that written promise as if he would have given it back to the king, Sully, instead of that, tore it in two, saying, "There, sir, as you wish to know, is what I think about such a promise." "Ah, morbleu, what are you at? Are you mad?" "It is true, sir, I am a madman and a fool, and I wish I were so much thereof as to be the only one in France." Very well, I understand you," said the king, "and will say no more, in order to keep my word to you; but give me back that paper." "Sir," replied Sully, "I have no doubt your Majesty is aware that you are destroying all the preparatives for your dismarriage, for this promise once divulged, and it is demanded of you for no other purpose, never will the queen your wife do the things necessary to make your dismarriage valid, nor indeed will the pope bestow upon it his apostolic blessing; that I know of my own knowledge." The king made no answer, went out of the gallery, entered his closet, asked for pen and ink, remained there a quarter of an hour, wrote out a second paper like that which had just been torn up, mounted his horse without saying a word to Sully, whom he met, went hunting, and during the day deposited the new promise of marriage with Henriette d'Entraigues, who kept it, or had it kept in perfect secrecy, till the 2d of July, the time at which her father, the Count of Entraigues, gave her up to the king in consideration of 20,000 crowns cash. In the teeth of all these incidents, known or voluntarily ignored, the negotiations for the annulment of the marriage of Henry IV and Marguerite de Valois were proceeded with at Rome by the consent of the two parties. Clement VIII had pronounced on the 17th of December, 1599, and transmitted to Paris by Cardinal de Joyeuse the decree of annulment. On the 6th of January, 1600, Henry IV gave his ambassador, Brulart de Sillery, powers to conclude at Florence his marriage with Mary de' Medici, daughter of Francis I. de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and Joan, Archduchess of Austria and niece of the Grand Duke Ferdinand I. de' Medici, who had often rendered Henry IV pecuniary services dearly paid for. As early as the year 1592 there had been something said about this project of alliance. It was resumed and carried out on the 5th of October, 1600, at Florence, with lavish magnificence. Mary embarked at Leghorn on the 17th with a fleet of 17 galleys; that of which she was aboard, the general, was all covered over with jewels, inside and out. She arrived at Marseilles on the 3d of November, and at Lyons on the 2d of December, where she waited till the 9th for the king, who was detained by the war with Savoy. He entered her chamber in the middle of the night, booted and armed, and next day, in the cathedral church at St. John, re-celebrated his marriage, more rich in wealth than it was destined to be in happiness. Mary de' Medici was beautiful in 1592, when she had first been talked about, and her portrait at that time had charmed the king; but in 1600 she was 27, tall, fat, with round staring eyes and a forbidding air, and ill dressed. She knew hardly a word of French, and Henriette d'Entraigues, whom the king had made Marquise de Verneuil, could not help exclaiming, when she saw her, "So that is the fat bankeress from Florence." Henry IV. seemed to have attained in his public and in his domestic life the pinnacle of earthly fortune and ambition. He was at one and the same time Catholic king and the head of the Protestant polity in Europe, accepted by the Catholics as the best, the only possible king for them in France. He was at peace with all Europe, except one petty prince, the Duke of Savoy, Charles Emmanuel I., from whom he demanded back the Marquisate of Saluzzo, or a territorial compensation in France itself on the French side of the Alps. After a short campaign, and thanks to Rosny's ordinance, he obtained what he desired, and by a treaty of January 17, 1601, he added to French territory La Bresse, Le Bugey, the district of Gex, and the citadel of Bourg, which still held out after the capture of the town. He was more and more dear to France, to which he had restored peace at home as well as abroad, and industrial, commercial, financial, monumental, and scientific prosperity until lately unknown. Sully covered the country with roads, bridges, canals, buildings, and works of public utility. The moment the king, after the annulment of his marriage with Marguerite de Valois, saw his new wife, Mary de' Medici, at Lyons, she had disgusted him, and she disgusted him more every day by her cantankerous and headstrong temper; but on the 27th of September, 1601, she brought him a son, who was to be Louis XIII. Henry used to go for distraction from his wife's temper to his favorite, Henriette d'Entraigues, who knew how to please him at the same time that she was haughty and exacting towards him. He set less store upon the peace of his household than upon that of his kingdom. He had established his favorite at the Louvre itself, close beside his wife; and his new marriage once contracted, he considered his domestic life settled, as well as his political position. He was mistaken on both points. He was not at the end of either his political dangers or his amorous fancies. Since 1595, his principal companion in arms, or rather his camp favorite, Charles de Gontaut, Baron de Biron, whom he had made admiral, duke, and marshal of France, was all the while continuing to serve him in the field, becoming day by day a determined conspirator against him. He had begun by being a reckless gamester, and in that way he lost 1,500,000 crowns, about 6 millions of francs of our day. "I don't know," said he, "whether I shall die on the scaffold or not, but I will never come to the poorhouse." He added, "When peace is concluded, the king's love affairs, the scarcity of his largesses, and the discontent of many will lead to plenty of splits, more than are necessary to embroil the most peaceful kingdoms in the world; and should that fail, we shall find in religion more than we want to put the most lukewarm Huguenot in a passion and the most penitent Leaguers in a fury." Henry IV. regarded Biron with tender affection. "I never loved anybody as I loved him," he used to say. "I would have trusted my son and my kingdom to him. He has done me good service, but he cannot say that I did not save his life 3 times. I pulled him out of the enemy's hands at Fontaine Francaise, so wounded and so dazed with blows that, as I had acted soldier in saving him, I also acted marshal as regarded the retreat." Biron, nevertheless, prosecuted his ambitious designs. The independent sovereignty of Burgundy was what he aspired to, and any alliance, any plot, was welcome as a stepping stone. "Caesar or nothing," he would say. "I will not die without seeing my head on a quarter-crown piece." He entered into flagrant conspiracy with the King of Spain, with the Duke of Savoy, with the French malcontents, the Duke of Bouillon, and the Count of Auvergne. Henry IV. knew it, and made every effort to appear ignorant of it, to win Biron back to him. He paid his debts; he sent him on an embassy; he tempted him to confessions which should entitle him to a full pardon. "Let him weep," he would say, "and I will weep with him. Let him remember what he owes me, and I will not forget what I owe him. I were loath that Marshal de Biron should be the first example of my just severity, and that my reign, which has hitherto been calm and serene, should be charged all at once with thunder and lightning." He employed Rosny to bring Biron to confess. "My friend," said he, "here is an unhappy man, the marshal; it is a serious case; I am anxious to spare him; I cannot bring myself to harm a man who has courage, who has served me so long and been so familiar to me. My fear is that though I spare him, he will not spare me or my children or my kingdom. He would never confess anything to me. He behaves to me like a man who has some mischief in his heart. I beg you to see him. If he is open with you, assure him that he may come to me and I will forgive him with all my heart." Rosny tried and failed. "It is not I who want to destroy this man," said the king; "it is he who wants to destroy himself. I will myself tell him that, if he lets himself be brought to justice, he has no mercy whatever to expect from me." He saw Biron at Fontainebleau, received him after dinner, spoke to him with his usual familiarity, and, pointing to his own equestrian statue in marble, which was on the mantelpiece, said, "What would the King of Spain say if he saw me like that, eh?" "He would not be much afraid of you," answered Biron. Henry gave him a stern look. The marshal tried to take back his words. "I mean, sir, if he were to see you in that statue yonder, and not in your own person." The retreat was not successful; the shot had taken effect. Henry left the room, went back into his closet, and gave orders to his captain of the guard to arrest him. Then he returned to the room and said, "Marshal, reflect upon what I have said to you." Biron preserved a frigid silence. "Adieu, Baron de Biron," said the king, thus by a single word annulling all his dignities, and sending him before his proper judges to answer for his treasons. On the 18th of June, 1602, he brought the marshal before the court of Parliament. The inquiry lasted 3 weeks. Biron was unanimously condemned to death by 127 judges, "for conspiracies against the king's person, attempts upon his kingdom, and treasons and treaties with the enemies of the kingdom." The king gave to this sentence all the alleviations compatible with public interests. He allowed Biron to make his will, remitted the confiscation of his property, and ordered that the execution should take place at the Bastille, in the presence of certain functionaries, and not on the Place de Greve and before the mob. When Biron found himself convicted and sentenced, he burst into a fury, loaded his judges with insults, and roared out that, "if he were driven to despair and frenzy, he would strangle half of those present, and force the other half to kill him." The executioner was obliged to strike him unawares. Those present withdrew dumbfounded at the crime, the prisoner's rage, the execution, and the scene. When the question of conspiracies and conspirators, with Spain against France and her king, had thus been publicly raised and decided, it entailed another: had the Spanish monks, the Jesuits to call them by their own name, taken part therein? Should proceedings accordingly be taken against them? They were no longer in France; they had been banished on the 29th of December, 1594, by a solemn decree of Parliament after John Chatel's attempt. They were demanding their return; the pope was demanding it for them. "If at other times," they said, "the society had shown hostility to France and her king, it was because, though well received everywhere else, especially in the dominions of the King of Spain, they had met in France with nothing but persecutions and insults. If Henry would be pleased to testify good will towards them, he would soon find them devoted to his person and his throne." The question was debated at the king's council, and especially between Henry IV. and Sully when they were together. Sully did not like the return of the Jesuits. "They are away," said he; "let them remain so. If they return, it will be all very fine for them to wish, and all very fine for them to act. Their presence, their discourse, their influence, involuntary though it be, will be opposed to you, will heat your enemies, will irritate your friends; hatred and mistrust will go on increasing." The king was of a different opinion. "Of necessity," he said to Sully, "I must now do one of two things: admit the Jesuits purely and simply, relieve them from the defamation and insults with which they have been blasted, and put to the proof all their fine sentiments and excellent promises, or use against them all severities that can be imagined to keep them from ever coming near me and my dominions; in which latter case there is no doubt it would be enough to reduce them to utter despair and to thoughts of attempting my life, which would render me miserable or listless, living constantly in suspicion of being poisoned or assassinated, for these gentry have communications and correspondence everywhere, and great dexterity in disposing men's minds as it seems good to them. It were better for me to be dead, being therein of Caesar's opinion that the pleasantest death is that which is least foreseen and apprehended." The king then called to remembrance the 8 projected or attempted assassinations which, since the failure of John Chatel from 1596 to 1603, had been, and clearly established to have been, directed against him. Upon this Sully at once went over to the king's opinion. In September 1603, letters for the restoration of the Jesuits were issued and referred to the Parliament of Paris. They there met, on the 24th of December, with strong opposition and remonstrances that have remained celebrated, the mouthpiece being the premier president Achille de Harlay, the same who had courageously withstood the Duke of Guise. He conjured the king to withdraw his letters patent and to leave intact the decree which had banished the Jesuits. This was not, he said, the feeling of the Parliament of Paris only, but also of the Parliaments of Normandy and Burgundy, that is, of 2/3 of the magistrates throughout the kingdom. Henry was touched and staggered. He thanked the Parliament most affectionately, but, "We must not reproach the Jesuits for the League," said he; "it was the fault of the times. Leave me to deal with this business; I have managed others far more difficult." The Parliament obeyed, though with regret, and on the 2d of January, 1604, the king's letters patent were enregistered. This was not the only business that Henry had at heart. He had another of another sort, and for him more difficult to manage. In February, 1609, he saw for the first time at the court of France Charlotte Marguerite, 3rd daughter of the Constable de Montmorency, only 16 years old. "There was at that time," say all contemporaries, "nothing so beautiful under heaven, or more graceful, or more perfect." Before presenting her at court, her father had promised her to Francis de Bassompierre, descended from a branch of the house of Cloves, 30 years old and already famous for his wit, his magnificence, and his gallantry. He was one of the principal gentlemen of the chamber to the king. Henry IV. sent for him one morning, made him kneel on a hassock in front of his bed, and said that, obtaining no sleep, he had been thinking of him the night before, and of getting him married. "As for me," says Bassompierre, who was thinking of nothing so little as of what he wanted to say to me, "I answered that if it were not for the constable's gout, it would have already been done. 'No,' said he to me, 'I thought of getting you married to Mademoiselle d'Aumale, and, in consequence of that marriage, of renewing the duchy of Aumale in your person.' I asked him if he wanted me to have 2 wives. Then he said to me with a deep sigh, 'Bassompierre, I will speak to thee as a friend. I have become not only enamored, but mad, beside myself, about Mademoiselle de Montmorency. If thou wed her and she love thee, I shall hate thee; if she loved me, thou wouldst hate me. It is better that this should not be the cause of destroying our good understanding, for I love thee affectionately and sincerely. I am resolved to marry her to my nephew the Prince of Conde, and keep her near my family. That shall be the consolation and the support of the old age which is coming upon me. I shall give my nephew, who is young and loves hunting 10,000 times better than women, 100,000 francs a year to pass his time, and I want no other favor from her but her affection, without looking for anything more." Thoroughly astounded and put out as he was, Bassompierre reflected that it was, so far as he was concerned, "an amour modified by marriage," and that it would be better to give way to the king with a good grace. And, "I withdraw, sir," he said, on very good terms as regarded Mademoiselle de Montmorency as well as himself. The king embraced him, wept, promised to love him dearly, saw him again in the evening in company with Mademoiselle de Montmorency, who knew nothing, and conversed a long while with the young princess. When she retired, perceiving that Bassompierre was watching her, she shrugged her shoulders, as if to hint to him what the king had said to her. "I lie not," says Bassompierre, "that single action pierced me to the heart. I spent 2 days in tormenting myself like one possessed, without sleeping, drinking, or eating." 2 or 3 days afterwards, the Prince of Conde announced that he intended to marry Mademoiselle de Montmorency. The court and the city talked of nothing but this romance and the betrothal which immediately followed. Section 14.